Welcome, new fans and regular listeners. This is Emmett, your host, and you are listening to Resolving Reality Radio. We have some new audio listening platforms for you to be aware of. Spreaker and TuneIn Radio, in addition to the usuals, iTunes Podcasts, Stitcher, Mixcloud, and finally SoundCloud for high-quality WAV or FLAC downloads. YouTube and BitChute for the video content, plus the audio version of the video interviews are available on those audio platforms already listed. Links for all of our social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, Gab, and Minds, all right there on the website resolvingreality.com. In this episode, I speak to Brandon Martinez, an independent writer and journalist from Canada who specializes in foreign policy issues, international affairs, and 20th and 21st century history. Brandon's YouTube channel is called Martinez Perspective, and the website is alt-right.com. In this interview, we speak about the mosque shooting in New Zealand and place it in a global context. We also discuss mass migration and multiculturalism, the EU and the Kalergi plan, Zionism, the Frankfurt School, and the importance of nationalism in Western countries today. That and more coming up, so stay right here with Resolving Reality Radio. Good afternoon, Brandon, and welcome to Resolving Reality.
Thanks for having me. Good afternoon.
No worries, man. Great to speak to you. Looking forward to hearing your insights on a few things today. And of course, for those, I'm kind of familiar with your work. I've heard about you over the years, different interviews and stuff you've been working on. But for people who are totally new to you, let's just give a slight kind of introduction here about your background. So tell us first of all about the website, alt-right.com, and the YouTube channel and the subjects that you cover, basically.
So the website alt-right.com, I started in 2017 with a friend of mine. It's my third website now. I've had two other websites before that, Non-Aligned Media, which is like a news commentary site, a site called Zion Crime Factory. And I started this site on the Trump election just because it was such a big news story at the time. And everybody was talking about the alt-right. So we figured out why not pick up this domain and see what we can do with it. And my YouTube channel is called Martinez Perspective, covering basically run-of-the-mill political issues of the day, a lot of nationalist type content, and focusing a lot on Zionism. That seemed to be like the main thrust of what I've done over the past 4 or 5 years. Just because that's, a big part of the power structure. Not allowed to admit that, obviously, but it affects us profoundly every day, right? Most people don't know anything about it, so somebody's got to talk about it. Somebody has to highlight it, and because I have this knowledge base, it's sort of, I feel like it's sort of my duty to inform people about it, right? Or how else are they going to get this kind of information?
Yeah, and what kind of topics started you off down this path? Was there any particular areas that kind of woke you up to things pretty much?
Yeah, so when I was about 18, 19 years old, this was 2009, that was my red pill awakening period where I'd stumbled on some documentaries on the internet that really started to challenge some of my preconceived opinions that had been fed to me throughout my schooling. And at that point, I decided I needed to re-educate myself. So I bought this trove of books. And two of them that really impacted me, one was called The Controversy of Zion by Douglas Reed, and the second one was called Under the Sign of the Scorpion by Yuri Lina. And these two books kind of go through the history of Zionism and their intrigues in different historical events, the world wars. It goes even back to the ancient times. It goes through the communist revolution in Russia. And I'd never really seen that information before, so I was just shocked how I had been deceived. And I decided, I had to get the information out there. I had to educate people. So I started making videos and writing articles for various websites and blogs and on YouTube. And that was kind of the start of my my activism, you could say.
Right, yeah. And what was it like for you in terms of, so many of us kind of get sucked into more left wing or quote unquote progressive types of thinking when we're younger. Was it like that for you, and you kind of had to snap out of it, or were you always on track?
Well, I had never really been politically active before that, so I certainly wasn't progressive. I maybe my worldview generally was liberal, just because that's what everybody is basically, if they don't really investigate these things. I hadn't gotten sucked into any political trend, so I was kind of like a blank slate at that time, which was good because I was able to look at this new information and not immediately reject it. I just didn't have this knee-jerk reaction to refute this information or dispute it. So as I was just kind of like a sponge at that time, I was able to acquire this new information, process it, and go out there and kind of expose it to other people.
Great, great. Yeah, we all have different stories, I suppose, but there are crossovers as well sometimes. And I think it's probably beneficial to stay away from any sort of real programming for at least a portion of your life. It leaves you open to other ideas. But moving into some of the things that you've been looking at recently, I know you've got the YouTube channel going as well and the website, and you did an analysis of the Christchurch shooting, which was very interesting. Now, I know everybody's talking about this, but what was your reaction to this, when you first heard about it?
Well, it wasn't that surprising because we've seen other such shootings recently. There was the Dylan Roof shooting. There was the synagogue attack that happened in Pittsburgh, I believe, in the U.S. And I hadn't heard of any big shootings. I guess there were a few back in Australia years ago. But my take on it is we have to be careful because I saw recently in the news that people are getting their houses raided because they've said something sympathetic to this shooter in Australia or New Zealand. So I obviously condemn the act, but my basic analysis of it is that you will find more violent events like this happening the more diverse your society is, and that's because diversity is is basically a petri dish for division and conflict. Because if we look just historically at various conflicts in Europe, I mean, you're from Ireland, you understand the civil war that happened in Ireland, the conflict between Ireland and England, the North and the South, that was based purely on political religious differences, despite being the same exact people, pretty much. You have Spain that broke down into a brutal civil war, even though it was one race and one religion, basically. You had Yugoslavia, you got Ukraine and Russia. You have the Czechs and the Slovaks split into two. So if my position is if white Europeans can't even get along and live in the same space, how do we expect dozens and dozens of different ethnic groups and religious groups to all be thrown into the same living space and just work it all out? So this is a byproduct of multiculturalism itself.
Yeah, it's an interesting take on it, and you certainly won't get that, of course not, from the mainstream media, and even among the independent alternative media. That point is often overlooked as well. People have been getting caught up in details about what happened at the event, and I think it's irrelevant. It's more about the consequences for the bigger picture. And on that note, so some people online have been talking about whether or not it was a real shooting. Do you think it was how real it was? Do you think it was staged at all in any way? And what do you make of those opinions saying that the event was just it didn't even happen?
Well, you have those people say that about every shooting. So it's I find it very hard to take those people seriously because they have the exact same analysis on every shooting, that everything's fake and everything is just a bunch of crisis actors running around. I don't buy that. The fact is, the guy live streamed the whole thing. How can you fake that? Unless they had some kind of video game playing on his live stream, it'd be very difficult to fake that. And the guy's in custody. The guy's in custody now, and he admits to doing this. So unless they brainwash this guy as some kind of Manchurian candidate, it's just far-fetched, right? So I believe it was real. There are there are examples in history of false flags, but that doesn't mean everything's a false flag. I can see a possible motive for them wanting to do that in order to demonize white nationalism and make it seem like it's a violent thing. But, there are also Islamic attacks going on. Over the past 5 years, there have been dozens of Islamic attacks, right? I don't see why they want to fake Islamic attacks, because they want us to believe that multiculturalism is good and that bringing in millions of Muslims is the right policy. So why would they then fake attacks by Muslims, which just turns people against them?
Yeah, exactly. Once you kind of break this down, it starts to become very clear. We know, of course, that maybe tighter gun controls is one of the potential objectives here as to why this event happened in the first place, or certainly how the media is dealing with it afterwards, and how they're painting it. We need to have more control of the guns and less guns. You also mentioned the whole Islam agenda and the nationalism thing. I mean, do you think those are the main reasons why this would be potentially kind of beneficial to the globalist contingent, or are there more reasons why they would they would view this as beneficial to them?
Well, it benefits them in terms of painting nationalists as violent terrorists. So the guy who did this obviously isn't really doing us a favor insofar as, we want to win over the majority of people in our societies. And the way to do that is not to go and kill people. They're just going to, view you as a lunatic, right? So it certainly did benefit them in that sense. That they're going to milk this thing for all that it's worth. They will, go for the gun grabbing, go for the censorship. It's really the same process after every shooting. They did the same thing after Pittsburgh, after the Dylan Roof, although they're not able to end free speech or gun rights in the United States, whereas in Australia and New Zealand, there's no real constitutional protections for that, right? So certainly the global elites will use violence that comes from our side against us. Absolutely, right? They want to have a situation where they can use events like this to go after nonviolent people, to go after people like you and me who are just speaking openly and honestly about these issues on the internet, and have us shut down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think as well another one could be of course, the lockdown on free speech, which has been happening here as well. We've had members of the Islamic community here talking about how, this is what happens when you allow hate online. So you're not even allowed to talk now, or they equate you with this almost going on a murderous rampage. And I think what I've seen as well from the independent media, even what they're missing is the Islamification agenda, as in, it's in the globalist interests to use Islam, from what I can see, to alter Europe. Because it's clearly not compatible with Western values. Do you think that's fair to say as well? Do you think that this is something that's overlooked? That the most obvious thing is in this situation that they've painted Muslims as victims. Now, those who are shot are victims, but it has an effect on the mind of those who see it, where they can't feel that they can criticize Islam at all now.
Yeah, there's a certain victimization mythology that develops after these shootings. The same with the synagogue shooting in the United States, believing that Jews are victims now when they form the majority of the power elite and have their own ethno-state. So they absolutely don't want you to talk about Islamization. New Zealand is this tiny country next to Australia, and yet they are still being flooded with people from the Middle East. Like, there's just no land space that whites currently occupy that's not going to be thrust into this multicultural nightmare. And Islamization is one aspect of it. It's like they want to, they're at the same time that they're breaking down the cultures of white people and say any organizational group that looks out for the interests of white people is immediately demonized and attacked as racist. But at the same time, there are hundreds of Muslim organizations of Sikhs and Hindus and all of these other ethnic groups that are encouraged to promote the racial and religious interests of their people in our countries. So this is just part of the cultural degradation of the West in general. In Muslims, of course, are the least culturally compatible group out of any, right? Probably the most culturally compatible are Asians. The least are Muslims. Any true believing Muslim has no respect at all for any form of government other than that of a pure Islamic state. There are varying degrees of that. There are varying types of Muslims, moderates and extremists, but Islam at its root preaches that man-made laws are invalid and that only Allah can create the laws. So virtually they present sort of like a Trojan horse community in the West. And I've seen undercover documentaries go into mosques, and you have the imams preaching to their flock that they need to stealthily take over the country through demographics by just out producing children with white people, and then they can implement their Islamic system after that. So this is an incredible danger to our civilization. But, of course, the left-wing media, now that their narrative is that all things white male is bad and all things brown and, non-Western is good, they're painting Muslims as victims when Muslims have obviously killed hundreds, if not thousands of people in terrorist attacks across the West over the past 3 years. And there's not the same type of outrage against Islam as there is against white people now.
Yeah, and I think what makes it complex as well is that you have, you've got the whole NATO dynamic. And for those of us who know, even 20th century history, we know that we had a lot of Western collusion and encouragement of Islamic extremism, as far back as the 80s and before that, of course. But, you look at the Mujahideen backed by the CIA in the 80s and all, the creation of ISIS and all that stuff. So I think that's what makes it complex for people. They think that the violent tendencies of Islam comes from Western provocation only. You know what I mean? But they're neglecting the fact that comes from the doctrine itself. So what's your take on this part of the dynamic?
Yeah, that's an example of simply Western powers making use of something that already exists. So they find these radicals, give them guns and say, go over here and overthrow this government because we don't like it. That doesn't mean that they created the doctrine. That doesn't mean that they are the architects of it. They're simply manipulating it for their own interests, their own temporary interests, geopolitically speaking. So in terms of the Mujahideen thing, the reason that the CIA was involved in that, because they were trying to stop the spread of communism and the Soviet Union's influence throughout the Middle East. So they decided that allying with these theocratic Muslims was a counterweight against the communists in the Middle East. So you saw like Afghanistan was a communist regime in the 70s. So the CIA started backing the opposition to that regime, which was these theocratic Muslims. So that's just a case of geopolitical scheming. There's obviously a backlash to it. Now, if these people were smart, if these Western powers, these elites that did that were smart, they would not in a million years invite the very radicals that they armed into our countries. Right? They would, they gave them guns to do this little thing in the Middle East. Well, then just stop them from coming into our countries and it wouldn't be a problem. It would just be a little dogfight in the Middle East, which has been happening, for hundreds of years prior to the CIA ever getting involved. So for those people who want to scapegoat like the CIA for creating all this is just missing the forest for the trees. So what about the invasions of Europe going back to the 700 AD when Islam first kicked off and colonized Spain, right? Mm-hmm. There was no CIA there to support that. In fact, it was the local Jews in Spain that supported it because they hated the Christians more.
Yeah, that's you got right to the heart of it straight away. This is the procurement of a weapon, that it was already there in the first place, but they just use it to kind of further their own agenda. And a lot of this comes back as well to a lot of this is smoke and mirrors and distraction, and the Christchurch shooting was there to achieve a few objectives, like we said. And you can look at the the mainstream media reports of New Zealand and the aftermath in Christchurch is like a circus. You know, a lot of crying, a lot of the Prime Minister wearing a hijab, just all of this. They're all acting Muslim now, and it just comes across as very fake and childish. And we know this comes back to the multiculturalism thing. So when did you start looking into that, first of all? And you know, what did you make of the Kalergi plan and everything when you encountered it first?
Well, it came on my radar years ago, back when I started. It wasn't as clear as it is today. I hadn't figured out the Kalergi stuff until maybe a few years ago, when the information about that started to come out in various nationalist circles. But when you look into it and you see the double standards when it comes to race, you know, you see that minorities are not only allowed to organize on racial lines, but are encouraged to do so, and in fact are promoted in the media and given benefits and cushy jobs and media positions for doing that, like Al Sharpton. When you recognize the double standards, it's just infuriating, and you want to speak out against it, because the bias is so clear against white males. And who's the main progenitor of this anti-white male discourse? Well, it's this cultural Marxist Frankfurt School project, right, that goes back to the 1930s. Starts in Germany. A group of Jewish Marxist intellectuals started this as a way to delegitimize kind of Western male patriarchy, because they believed that Jews were persecuted under this nationalistic type systems in the West. So they had to begin to chip away at that. So these people migrated over to the United States and to Columbia University. They were funded by the American Jewish Committee. They set up a think tank there, and they started pumping out the anti-white male propaganda. And slowly but surely, they took over all the major universities across the U.S. and the West in general. I just saw a video on the Netherlands showing how communists took over all of those universities and control them to this day. And they put out this narrative that white people have no right to exist, that race doesn't exist, that gender doesn't exist, that anything natural and normal should be essentially reversed, and whatever's the inverse of normal should be promoted as a good, just, and righteous. So that's where all the gender politics comes from. That's where all this SJW stuff comes from. And the Kalergi plan, you know, is part of that. It's you know, Coudenhove Kalergi, the Count, famous guy from the 1930s. He started pushing this idea of European integration, what was initially the European Union, and he says explicitly in his book Practical Idealism, he says that he wants to see the world, the white European race, mongrelized and turned into a mixed race, a European Negro-Eurasian hybrid race, and that this whole project would be guided by what he called the spiritual leadership class, the chosen race of Jews. These are his words. He says Jews are the chosen race, and they will lead this new world in Europe. And he seems to be the founding influence behind a lot of the EU politicians. Merkel seems to be connected. There's this Charlemagne Prize that's awarded to various politicians who promote this agenda. And you can see it playing out. You know, Nicolas Sarkozy from France, years ago, he gave a speech where he said that we're going to enforce racial interbreeding on his population. Like, just ludicrous statements like that. They're going to regulate, you know, relationships and essentially enforce a race mixing agenda on the population. You look at the advertising promoting mixed relationships, the commercials, the music videos, all of this promotion of mixing. It's only targeted against white people, of course. So it seems like there's validity to this conspiracy, that it really comes back to this kind of revenge fantasy of these cultural Marxists.
Yeah, and I mean, this guy is, of course, what's happening in Europe, which I know you're very aware of what's going on here and how it's affecting all of the different countries, even amongst those who are against this and who know it's a bad thing, this multicultural experiment. They're not aware of Kalergi himself, you know, because it's, I don't know if I'm oversimplifying it here, but I think he is to European Union ideology and pan-Europeanism as Marx was to everything else, you know, socialist and Marxist. I mean, the ideas have to come from somewhere, and they seem to have come from him, and he was certainly one of the more outspoken ones. But do you think he was more of just a front man, so to speak, or a mouthpiece, or was he representing anyone, do you think?
Well, you know, it's hard to say if he truly believed in these ideas or he was just saying them because he was being paid to say them. I know for a fact that he was funded by very powerful Jewish bankers such as Max Warburg, and he was friends with the Rothschilds. And they started funding him. And the reason they did that was because, you know, it says it in this article. I mean, I have a chapter in my book, Grand Deceptions, on this. In the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, it said that at the first Pan-European Congress, which he was promoting his ideas, he said that it said many individual European Jews are furthering the Pan-European movement by giving it financial support. And among the messages received from various countries, it lists several prominent Jews like Leon Blum, George Brandeis, Harry Warburg, and Max Reinhardt. It said Kalergi himself is married to a Jewess, and that he said that his opinion that the Pan-European movement ought to find particular support on the part of the Jews who were scattered throughout Europe, because the creation of a United States of Europe will be beneficial to Jews as it would eliminate racial hatred and economic rivalry. So you can see his platform was philo-Semitic from the beginning, and that is why they supported him, because he was basically advocating for a philo-Semitic policy. He says it right in Practical Idealism that they will achieve a top position at the top of this hierarchical pyramid within the Pan-European structure, and then the rest of the Europeans are just going to be mixed out of existence.
And there's obviously the Kalergiite contingent in Brussels as well is continuing that ideology. And I believe that, correct me if I'm wrong here, I think Nick Clegg brought it up in Brussels at one stage. He actually quoted from Kalergi's works, and he was booed. he was booed out of there, I believe, because that was
Nick Griffin, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Nick Griffin, yeah. He was so that's how crazy it is. You're actually confronting them with the ideology that they actually are representing, and they immediately try to censor him. And
right.
of course, as well, we have Peter Sutherland, who passed away here, I think last year, the year before, and he was the big mouthpiece in this country about the whole globalist multicultural agenda. What do you know about this guy?
I mentioned him in my book. He's one of these rich bankers who worked with the United Nations to promote unrestricted immigration into Europe alongside George Soros and other billionaires. I don't know supposedly he's Irish, right? Mm-hmm. But maybe I don't know if he's Jewish or not. It wouldn't surprise me if he is, but it seems to be that these people like George Soros, his own son, Alex Soros, admitted in an interview with a New Yorker magazine that his father, his motive for doing what he does is his Jewish identity. He says it explicitly. He says that he promotes massive immigration and liberal politics because he wants to create an open society that accepts everyone and accepts everything and tolerates anything. And this is a world in which Jews are safe. So it seems like that is the agenda behind a lot of these people. They bring in fellow travelers, Gentiles that are sympathetic to it or just totally corrupted by money, like perhaps Peter Sutherland is one of them. But they're promoting an absolutely self-destructive policy of erasing European cultures under the guise of building the economy or something to that effect, that white Europeans are not having enough children, so therefore we need to bring in all these immigrants to replace us. But why aren't Europeans having that many children? Well, it's because the cultural Marxists have told them not to, have brainwashed millions of white women to abandon children and to just pursue careers and to just even hate men in the form of this feminist movement. So every step of the way, they've broken down white European cultures, promoting, propaganda that convinces them that they're guilty, their ancestors are guilty, they should mix with another race to rectify their white guilt. So they've orchestrated this decline in white birth rates and then proposed the solution is to replace us with immigration from the third world. Pretty crazy.
It's like a soft, creeping tyranny, like a Fabian socialist kind of communist light takeover where it's happening over the generations. And I think that education, quote unquote, is a big part of that. How the universities operate, how the mainstream media operates, influences how people perceive reality. And feminism is one of the facets of it, and there are multiculturalism and many others as well. You brought up the Frankfurt School, and I think that's a key thing to look at, a key source to look at here, because it was kind of one of the forerunners of this transforming how people think. So tell us about the Frankfurt School's origins and what was its purpose officially.
So it started off in Germany in the 30s. A number of Jewish Marxist professors started this organization as sort of like a cultural critique of modern Europe. So the book by Kevin MacDonald goes into this. His book is called Culture of Critique. And what they endeavor to do is to so radically critique Western society and civilization so as to overthrow it, so as to deconstruct it, so as to reconstruct a new society that is completely defanged of any sort of nationalistic or what they consider to be fascistic sentiment. So one of the main books was The Authoritarian Personality by Theodor Adorno. He was sponsored in the Frankfurt School by the American Jewish Committee in the U.S. He had a thing called the Studies in Prejudice project, where he was basically saying that all white males or all white people in general are inherently prejudiced against minorities, and that in order to fight this, they have to basically reduce any kind of feelings of racial consciousness or solidarity among the population. And the way to do that is, of course, promote ideas of guilt, of historical wrongdoings, colonialism, all of these things, of slavery. All of these things are wielded like an ideological sledgehammer against white people in order to break down their ethnic and racial bonds so as to create the conditions needed to replace those people, right? So that's pretty much where it stems from. And then it really took on a life of its own, just usurping the social sciences departments of pretty much every major university in the Western world. There's not a single major Western university that isn't totally run by these cultural Marxists who are, steeped in the lore of the Frankfurt School and all these people, right? And the vast majority of them were Jewish, and they had Kevin MacDonald says that Horkheimer spoke of his strong Jewish identity, and that this was the primary motivating factor behind what he was doing there, just as George Soros has confessed to that as well. It's really just this historical revenge fantasy against Gentile Europeans and Christians, and the way to get back at us is to promote the cultural degradation of our states through these radical, progressive policies that effectively neuter the family and neuter any kind of solidarity amongst Europeans, right?
Mm-hmm. And it explains the way it seems like it's been, creeping away in the background, and now it's kind of in your face, everywhere in the West. And it's I noticed one of the things that kind of woke me up, Brandon, was the fact that I lived in London for about 5 years, and then I was in Australia for pretty much the same time. So it was interesting for me to see these ideologies being repeated by people like parrots in all the places I was. Not everyone, of course, but those who are prone to such programming. And as well, many of the people who've come from universities are repeating the same ideas. And that was my kind of part of my awakening process. I thought, this can't be a coincidence. This is seems like a coordinated plan, if nothing else. And
they have no arguments, right? They just repeat the same exact slogans as if reading a script.
Yeah. And I think part of it as well, because, looking right into the psychology of it, because it is relevant, because we are all people with our own emotions and everything. I don't mean psychology in an academic sense. I mean an everyday common sense perspective. People's egos play a role in this, because if someone goes to college and they've spent a lot of time and a lot of money, and someone has told them, look, this is the way it is, multiculturalism, a better example is equality equals love, equality equals morality. And they hear that for a few years in university, and then they leave university. That's how they think. And they've no idea that the concept of equality comes from Marxism, which is kind of had many failures. And this is, like I said, I've seen in Australia. You're from Canada, right? So I presume it was the same kind of thing over there as well.
Oh, absolutely. Canada is one of the most infected nations with this ideology. In fact, the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, is an avowed SJW himself, who made it his political platform. I mean, he had all of his posters while he's campaigning in the rainbow flag, and he would constantly attend the Gay Pride March in Toronto. So, like, this is the official state ideology, and of course, all that Jordan Peterson fiasco that's in Toronto as well. So I was shocked to learn that Ireland had also been infected with this, because I thought, maybe there's some kind of, they're living on an island. Maybe there's some kind of protection and isolation there, but apparently not.
No, it's getting, that's another aspect to my learning, my awakening process, was how quickly, because when I left Ireland to travel, it would have been 2004 the first time. By the time I came back here and resettled 2015, the place had really changed. And you could see this multicultural, the neo-Marxist ideologies all over the place, and they're very clear to me. It's like, if you haven't seen someone in a while and they've changed their appearance, you'll notice it quicker than someone who sees them every day. And so things are pretty kind of mental, and it's really in your face. The media is very pro-globalist, of course. Again, a lot of people who come from universities spouting the same nonsense, and even though you're right, we are detached geographically, but it's almost like a good way of putting it is that the globalist plans for different countries have slightly a different formula. And in Ireland's case, it was like, we were struggling from independence from the British till, officially 1949, really. We had a British monarch till then officially. And it was only a few decades later that we were in the European Economic Community. So, it's... One
thing I noticed about Irish people is that, well, at least some of them that I've talked to here, is they have this underdog mentality where they think, because of this grudge that they have against England because of the conflict, that their main enemy is, the white man, or is another white colonial power. And this has caused them to have sympathy with like non-white, brown, third world causes. So like they almost view themselves as they almost put themselves as part of the third world because they were subjugated by England. And this lends itself to just accepting a whole host of absolutely detrimental social policies that harm their own nation, such as supporting massive non-white third world immigration. So it's like they fought all these years to gain their independence from England, and then they're just inviting the third world in to take over anyway.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of looking at it, and I'm sure it's correct for some people as well. And what they don't realize is that the European Union is an empire, and the globalism and neo-Marxism are a new type of tyranny. So it's different to the past where you had the British soldiers in the streets, and, you know, the lack of rights for Irish people, whereas, you know, the Protestants, well, those in the rich part of the Protestant community were given all the political power and all the financial support because they were allied to the crown and all of that. Despite all those factors, basically this is still imperialism, and those people who are supporting mass migration are doing the bidding of the new empire, but they don't realize it. So maybe some of them do feel that solidarity for the victims, kind of. And you know, as you know yourself, the victim attitude all comes from Marxism in the end, and a lot of people have bought into it, I think.
Yeah, that seems to be the mindset of a lot of these people, and you know, I've argued with these people, and that's really something you can throw at them. It's like, you're such a staunch supporter of Irish independence from basically another white group that are genetically very similar, yet at the same time you support the conquest of your nation through third world immigration. That's completely crazy. There was literally no point to the independence fight. You just invalidated it with immigration, right? So this is something they can't really logically work out in their heads, but it's like logic doesn't seem to apply to the SJW.
Yeah, and as well, I think part of this, Brandon, is that, as you know yourself, part of what makes this system of the neo-Marxist, globalist, multicultural system is effective is what they do is they remove you from your history, and they remove you from any sort of patriotic, nationalistic, we are different attitudes, and that lays the foundations for you accepting their bullshit. So in the case of Ireland, the whole, you know, we need to be free from the British is something that's kind of always been dampened down from certain quarters, and you certainly won't hear a lot of emphasis on that in Irish society from as many quarters as there should be, basically. I think that any Irish person worth their salt should hate the idea of imperialism, you know, and should hate the idea of external control, but they lost sight of that. Not everyone. You know, not everyone's the same here, of course. Even amongst Catholics, even amongst full-blooded Irish people, they're not all the same. Some people are very passionate and hate the idea of British imperialism. Some people don't think it's important, you know, and those are the ones who are a part of the problem. I think they've kind of they associate Irish freedom and national sovereignty with Irish republicanism. You know, the Marxist IRA side of it, you know, putting bombs in pubs and murdering people. You're not allowed to be nationalist. That's kind of my take on it anyway.
Well, that was kind of a weird Marxist nationalism that they had. It was just like an anti-colonial nationalism that wasn't too rooted in identity. But of course, Ireland has a strong historical identity. You got the Druids and all this amazing lore going on that, you know, I don't even know too much about, and then to just throw it all away in the name of diversity is the height of insanity. This small little island that they have, they've bled and fought and you know, toiled for centuries to procure this small little living space, and yet we see it's being handed off to Nigerians and Pakistanis and people who have absolutely no historical nor genetic connection to this land. It's just absolutely crazy. So, you know, I can't even believe it sometimes when I see people supporting this.
Yeah, I think as well, I mean, as I said there, even not all Irish people and not all people who identify as Catholic or full-blooded Irish, not even they are proud enough of their past and know about their past. So certainly someone coming from Africa isn't going to know or have a clue or care about the Irish past at all. And that's part of the problem, you know, is that the British imperialism, which lasted till, you know, officially 49, which never really stopped, and then we joined the European Union, the effect of that constant, you know, globalist influence has eroded away the Irish national pride. That's what's happened. And I think the difference between Ireland as well, and it sounds like I'm just, you know, being self-orientated here or are proud about it, but Ireland is quite unique in a way when you look at all the Western countries, whether you're talking about Canada, Australia, the UK, the US, South Africa, or any other the European countries, the difference between Ireland is that we're primarily English speaking, and we've kind of had a very strong ethnic sort of background and tribal background, going as far back as the Celts, as you said, and then the Druids even further back than that. But we're unique in that the age of the country and Irishness is older, because in all these other countries, Australia and Canada, they're part of the Commonwealth and that British influence, but they're much newer countries. I think that's part of it as well, the age of things. But as you know, like when you look at the way the academic thing, you're talking about the Frankfurt School and the neo-Marxism, that's been kind of rocking since the 60s, hasn't it? Like they've been really hitting hard with the programming since about then. Is that right?
Yeah. Your point about Ireland having a rich history and being older, that just lends more credence to nationalism. That was one of the things I was missing from being in Canada, is that I was missing something there. It's like this very new country. It doesn't have a lot of history. There's no real impressive historical sites that you can visit, castles or cathedrals or anything of that sort. It's very modern. It's very new. It's very urban. And it really, it doesn't have that sentimental value that you can find in old Europe. So that's even more of a reason to want to protect these cultures, right? I moved myself to Spain for that reason, got in touch with my Spanish roots. My dad's side comes from Spain. So, and I do feel a lot better in Spain. I can visit all these ancient historical sites that were there 1,000 years ago, right? And it really gives you a sense of identity that you just don't have in the modernist Commonwealth countries of like Canada, the US, and Australia. But there still are people there that do have a strong identity. I would say it's more so in the United States than in Canada. For some reason, Canadians are extremely weak, and anything to do with race is just like they treat it like a plague. Like they have to wear one of those full body suits when we're talking about race. So I'm not sure if anything can be done to fix that part of the world, but certainly Europe, we need to really fight for our history and traditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the plans, this global plan for just total control and the one world government stuff, they definitely had slight variations on their tactics depending on which country they're trying to push it in. And in Ireland's case, they've been kind of on top of us for hundreds of years with the British Crown. And then, like I said, it was the push to the European Union. And maybe with countries like Canada and Australia, because they're so much newer, it's like they already refined their tactics before they created these countries, with the British Crown, and obviously the French Empire as well was involved in Canada too. And I think that's probably part of it, that it was somewhere like Ireland, because of the strong tribal instincts in some Irish people, they had to keep us suppressed for longer, you know what I mean, to keep us like pushed down and keep it consistent pressure over such a long period. Whereas with somewhere like Australia, when I was there, it's very easy going. It's all about work, consumerism, and also the globalism stuff. So people are either on board with globalism or they don't care, and there's only a few who are engaged with it in a constructive way, I would say.
And there's another problem I see is that a lot of Europeans are putting their petty inter-European rivalries and grudges above the bigger threat. And the bigger threat is massive third world immigration. So we have a common enemy now. So I think we can put aside the differences, the small linguistic / cultural / religious differences that we have in Europe, and unite against our common enemy, which seeks the ultimate replacement of our people, the great replacement. There will be no more Ireland or England or Spain or Italy when these globalist lunatics have had their way with us. There will just be a globalist shopping mall with just a host of different mixed people, trying to get their hands on the latest iPhone. That will be the new reality. And it's just sad to see, people from Ireland and England still feuding with each other over that. You have in Spain the Basques and the Catalonians are picking a fight over, independence. Here you have the Ukrainians and the Russians. It's just sad that Europeans can't see the bigger picture and unite. So maybe this idea, this Kalergist idea of a European Union or an integrated Europe, that would in one sense lessen the hostility between Europeans. So it's not 100% bad. But the problem is that the people in control of it right now have catastrophically destructive policies and malintentions for us, and they need to be replaced immediately.
Yeah, and it's like none of these governments, like all Western governments, or probably most governments, they don't do their jobs anyhow. Like they don't manage the countries properly anyway. Like in Ireland, where the same problems constantly about lack of housing, crime in some areas, homelessness, and the hospital waiting lists. And I'm always repeating them because they're still problems, after all so many years. And so my point always is to the globalists, multiculturalists, put racism aside for a moment, forget about it. Let's just talk in terms of technical, practical, everyday logistics. If the Irish government, and that's Ireland is just one example, of course, if they can't handle the Irish population, those who are here already in terms of services and all that stuff, how on earth is bringing more people into the equation going to make it easier? It's mental stuff.
Yeah, they can never answer that, right? They can never really justify why this will make our society better, why these problems that we have will be alleviated through immigration. They would only be exacerbated. Of course, the more people you have, the more of a housing crisis you're going to have on your hands. You're going to have more homeless people. You're going to have more people out of a job. You're going to have more people fighting over jobs. Nothing is solved through immigration, literally nothing. Just honestly, not a single thing we could say, a single benefit we can bring up to having third world immigration. Now, having immigration between European countries, that could work out and has been done. But to bring in a totally new culture and racial group into Europe and expect them to just assimilate and act like they are part of us, it's just known that can't work historically, right? No, there's not a single multicultural, multiracial country that we can say is a harmonious country, right? You look at Brazil, that's like one of the most mixed race countries in the world, and that's just by race. The religion, I believe, is majority Catholic, and that has one of the highest murder rates per capita in the world, right? You even have South Africa, where it's only two ethnic groups, blacks and whites are getting mass murdered on their own farms, and still the racial tensions are only ever growing. Yet at the same time, these people are telling us that we need to have 30 to 40 different ethnic groups, 50 different religions, every possible cultural proclivity imaginable, all in the tiny living space of Europe. It's one of the smallest places. Like the whole continent of Europe is smaller than China. It's smaller than major countries. So the idea that bringing in millions of people will solve anything is just the height of idiocy. These people cannot stand up to scrutiny, which is why they don't debate, right? Have you ever seen a real debate with a Marxist versus a nationalist?
No. No, they don't do practical things, and they certainly don't do economics, and that's why all of these newer strains of Marxism, when the Marxist regimes fell apart in the 80s, they never worked in the first place, but when it started becoming more obvious, they split into the climate change camp and the cultural Marxist camp, and I mean they that's what happens when you keep rehashing something that doesn't work, but they're all just new strains of this original philosophy, which is like based on the idea of equality. And when you force equality, one of the things that happens is you destroy how an economy works, how a country works. So whatever emotional ideas you had about love and harmony go out the window when there's no food and then there's no one to provide the services. It just kind of leads to chaos in the end, doesn't it?
Well, everybody's fighting over territory, over resources, over jobs, and that's what multiculturalism ultimately boils down to, is tribal warfare, right? We see it today in the United States. You have all these minority ethnic groups organizing together to get more free gibs in the government. Their only demand is that their ethnic group be privileged, that their ethnic group be prioritized, and that whites be thrown to the curb. So to see white people actually supporting something that is contrary to their own direct well-being in the country, it's just amazing. Maybe it's only white people that can convince themselves that their own interests don't matter and that the interests of foreign peoples who care absolutely nothing about you or your people should be put above your own, right? Maybe you can only convince intelligent people to do these catastrophically stupid things, you know.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. As we come towards the end here, Brandon, what have you got coming up going forward? Like, tell us about the plans to keep doing the work that you do.
Well, right now I'm working mostly on my YouTube channel, Martinez Perspective. I've been producing commentaries, and I'm trying to do a little bit more kind of real world activism. I went to a feminist protest recently in Spain and was putting the logic test to these feminists, and they ultimately ran away from me because they had no arguments. But I want to get into more like street interviews and activism and do stuff like that. But it's always a danger, right? Because I have to exist in this economy. Therefore, I have to have a day job. And if, some of my material found its way to my employer, that would be it for my livelihood, right? So it's just so difficult to exist in this world as a nationalist making these common sense arguments because the pressure is just so incredible. When they want to get you, when they smell blood, they will come after you. They will destroy your life. They will ruin your life simply because they don't like your opinions. So it's just a total danger. But, my name is already out there. I'm already pretty much public on those things. So I don't believe that we can give up. I think we have to continue to fight this fight, or else we'll be extinguished and there'll be nothing left, of course. So the main thing is the YouTube channel right now. I haven't really been writing too many articles because it's pretty time consuming, but I do post my videos on the website, alt-right.com. So you can look there for any future stuff.
Cool. Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, it's I'll put those links in the description as well and promote those for you on the website as well. And I know it's difficult dealing with all that stuff because the pressure seems to be increasing, but there are plenty of individuals out there waking up as well. So I think it's just good for us to kind of box clever and be smart about how we do it, but continue to do our work and do it that way online, I suppose.
Absolutely. We kind of have to be careful about what we say and, don't break the law, understand what the laws are, but be firm on it at the same time. We can't afford to just mince our words and dance around the issues. We have to really be forthright and say, this is an invasion, right? This is a diabolical agenda against the West, and we need to stand up against it. So I appreciate you having me on. I'd like to have you on my live stream on my channel sometime.
Yeah, absolutely, Brandon. You're welcome, first of all. And yeah, that sounds cool. So we can tee that up sometime. And I'd love to be on your show. No worries. Brandon Martinez, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
This is Resolving Reality Radio. Thanks so much for listening. That was Brandon Martinez, independent writer and journalist. Brandon's YouTube channel is Martinez Perspective and the website is alt-right.com.
You are listening to Resolving Reality Radio, the podcast for Ireland's new independent media website, resolvingreality.com.